All right. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another fantastic debate for you. And we're going to jump into some good old open theism. Is open theism biblical? And I have Mr. Chris Fisher and Jonathan Singleton with me, and they are going to be debating this hot topic. This is always a hot topic within the theological landscape, so I'm glad that you have joined me. But before we bring you guys in, I do want to encourage you to subscribe to The Gospel Truth. Make sure you hit that notification bell and hit that subscribe. Please do that because you don't want to miss out on any shows, debates, interviews, or anything I have coming up here in the future. I also upload videos and stuff, so you don't want to miss out on anything of that nature. All right, so make sure you're subscribing and hitting that notification bell. All this content is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Well, not the debates, but TikTok. I like to do little quick response videos and deal with some of the theological issues or things like that. Do some responses and things like that. If you're interested in that kind of type of thing and you like those little quick 1 minute, 3 minute videos, TikTok is the place to go. So make sure that you subscribe and follow over TikTok so you don't miss out on anything, and all those other platforms as well. If you just rather listen to audio, that option is available for you. I do have a podcast, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. So make sure you're flowing over there and subscribing and following on the podcast platform as well, wherever you do, Spotify, whatever it is. Subscribe on those platforms as well. As always, I have some shows coming up here in the future that I want you to be aware of. All right, coming up soon. Does the Bible teach the deity of Christ? This is Mr. Jeremiah Short and Mansour. Jeremiah Short goes by also the Black Doctor. He is big on TikTok. So if you are looking for a great guy who knows his stuff on TikTok, the Black Doctor is who you want to find on there. And then Mansour, they had a semi-discussion before, but I think they had like another debate on a different subject, but they're coming on the Gospel Truth soon. And I think in about 2 weeks to have another debate concerning the deity of Christ. So hopefully you're looking forward to that one. After that, I have Dr. James Anderson coming on. And speaking of open theism, he is going to be having an interview with me concerning determinism and open theism. And so if you don't know, Dr. James Anderson from the Reformed Theological Seminary, and I'm looking forward to him coming on. He's been on before, and we talked about some presuppositional apologetics, and he is mine, man. This dude is sharp, and I'm looking forward to him coming on. After that, I have another debate coming up, 2-on-2 debate. Is the God of the Bible triune? I have Vocab, Dr. Edward Decor, I have Otis Lewis, and the guy, he calls himself Hope Man, H-O-P-E, Hope Man, and they are coming on to have a great Trinitarian debate. And I'm looking forward to two guys, Mr. Otis Lewis and Hope Man are oneness. So, and you know, Vocab and Dr. Edward Decor are Trinitarian. So it's going to be a fun debate. So hopefully you're looking forward to that one as I am. After that, we have an interview coming up. I have Pastor Luke Pearson from Apologia Church is going to be joining me. The problem with wokeism. Yeah, this is a hot topic. This is always going to be a hot topic. And it's probably going to be one that the believer, the Christian, is dealing with and contending against for a long time coming. So it's always good to stay abreast of the current wokeism stuff. So I'm bringing Pastor Luke on with me, and we're going to have a fantastic discussion concerning this. All right. And then lastly, once again, I've been promoting this for about a month now. The Gospel Truth is having a fundraiser. We're trying to raise funds for audio and video equipment to take on the road. As you know, the Gospel Truth has been on the road. We've done in-person debates, and I want to be prepared for if a debate is in a venue that doesn't necessarily have audio and video equipment. This is going to help us do that, right? To be prepared for whatever we encounter. Nonetheless, if you're interested in helping with this fundraiser, the links are in the description of this video. So check it out if you are interested. All right. That said, once again, this is going to be a fun debate, an exciting debate. Open theism is always a hot topic, in particular with Calvinists and non-Calvinists. Or now, I'm not saying Jonathan's a Calvinist. I'm not saying that like that. But what I am saying is that that's typically the hot topic between the two camps. And so we're going to have a fun debate. You remember Chris Fisher? Chris Fisher hasn't been on the Gospel Truth before, but Chris Fisher has participated in a number of debates. And I think his most recent debate is a 2-on-2 where him and Will Duffy participated against Francis Turretin and Dan Chapa. I think that's his most recent debate, a 2-on-2 debate. And I thought that debate went very well. Jonathan Singleton has been on other platforms. He's been on Modern Day Debate, and he's a very good debater. I watch his debate, and I think he's very sound in the way he argues. And I think this is going to be a great time. I was sharing with the guys before we started the stream that I always vet those who are coming on, and I watched both of the debates, and I thought they would mesh very well. But enough of me blabbing on. Let me bring these guys in so they can introduce themselves to you. How you doing, fellas? How's everything?
It's good. I'm glad that we got through the vetting process.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm surprised.
I don't know, Chris. I found some stuff in your background, man. I kind of was like sketchy on, I don't know, brother. I don't know,
it's
man.
All
I don't know,
sketchy.
man.
It's all sketchy.
Oh man, no, it's funny. It's fun stuff though. I'm glad you guys joined me. I appreciate you guys for coming on. And so we're gonna jump into this, man. But before we do, I want to give you guys a chance to introduce yourselves to the audience. Tell them what you do, blogs, whatever it is. Tell them what you do so they can come check you out. All right. Start with Jonathan, if you don't mind. Give a quick introduction yourself.
Sure. It's great to be here. Thanks everyone for being here. And thank you for hosting, Marlon. And thank you, Chris Fisher, for being here as well. I don't do YouTube anymore. I just do Facebook. I really like that platform for ministry. So you can find me. My name is Jonathan Singleton on Facebook. And yeah, it's just my name in general. So that's how you can find me there. And other than that, I just like debating, really been learning a lot about theology, very interested, very led to be getting into different topics, and really excited to debate this one tonight. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about it. I'm ready to get to it and very excited.
All right. I'm excited to have you, Jonathan. I'm excited to have you. All right, Chris, you up, man. Go ahead, give a quick introduction to yourself.
Fantastic. Yeah, me and Jonathan Singleton go way back. As the comments, I was looking at the comments a little earlier, and some guys like, aren't these guys both heretics? That's us. We're friends. We're together. But my name is Christopher Fisher. I run the God is Open podcast. You can find that on godisopen.com, or else you could go to my YouTube channel. You could type in God is Open, or else like the short names like Reality is Not Optional. It's more of like a broad categorization. So you can also go to realityisnotoptional.com for mostly not theology stuff. And so godisopen.com is probably a better resource. And there you'll find my very nice tool that goes through various verses in the Bible, the verse reference sheet, which talks about most all of the common proof texts you're going to find in open theist debates. So thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thank you guys both for joining me today, and I am excited for this one. Once again, the topic of this debate is open theism biblical. All right, we're going to start that off with 10-minute opening statements. Then we're going to follow that with 5-minute rebuttals, and then we're going to have 40-minute cross-sects. Both of you get 20 minutes each to ask questions, and then we're going to follow that with 5-minute closings, and there's some Q&A from the audience. Sounds good? All right. So also remember, you'll hear this little chime at your 1-minute mark of your presentation. So make sure you keep your ear out on that one so you know when to start concluding. All right. That said, Chris, you'll argue the affirmative in this debate, so you'll be up first. And so I'll start your time when you begin to speak.
All right. I want to speak briefly about the title of this debate. Is open theism biblical? I love this title, because this debate is not about what I believe. That doesn't matter. This debate is not about what Jonathan believes. Tonight, that's not interesting. No offense. We're not here tonight to hear stories about what we think our proof texts mean. We're here to examine if the evidence shows our proof texts mean what we claim. We're here to see what the Bible actually teaches about who God is. Does the Bible teach open theism? So what is open theism? For the purposes tonight, any theistic mutalism, any change in God, particularly his knowledge. Open theism is a denial of classical omniscience. Now, classical omniscience, that's a weird word, right? It states that God has innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions, past, present, and future. It has to be innate because if God gains knowledge at some point, then God does not have exhaustive knowledge. Gained omniscience means open theism is true. It has to be ungenerated because God's knowledge can't be dependent. Dependent knowledge is acquired knowledge. Dependent knowledge means open theism is true. It has to be non-discursive. Discursive thought is when you think through ideas and you process information. If God has thoughts, if God can think, open theism is true. If God can think, open theism is true. God's knowledge can't be falsifiable. What do we mean by that? What he knows must be true and can't be false. If what God knows will happen, then does not happen, then open theism is true. The Bible is notoriously absent this category of thinking, classical omniscience, even to the extent it made it into the Yale lectures on the Hebrew Bible. Professor Christine Hayes gives a little laugh, perhaps remembering interactions with certain students when she says, the God of the Bible changes his mind. It's just a fact of the text. She elsewhere points out that attributes like omniscience are not attributed to Yahweh in the Bible. He even learns about man's character. Raphael Pettazzoni surveys ancient religious concepts of omniscience around the world. He observes that in ancient Israelite religion, Yahweh's omniscience is not absolute. It is primarily a visual omniscience, with particular focus on man's activity. We see this type of gained knowledge throughout the Bible. God knows because he sees. Hebrews 4:13. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. God knows because he does. Isaiah 46:10, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel will stand, I will accomplish all my purpose. God knows because he predicts. Psalms 139:1. O Lord, you have searched me, and known me. Psalms 139:4. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. God knows because he tests. Deuteronomy 8:2. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Any one of these by itself proves open theism is true. Any single example of God learning is enough to prove that God does not have innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions. The reverse is not true. God knowing one thing about the future does not mean God has classical omniscience. That's the fallacy of composition, and it's a huge leap of logic. Within the Bible, one might find claims that God knows some things in the future. Yes, in the Bible, God does know some things about the future. I know some things about the future. I'm not even that knowledgeable. Or within the Bible, one might find general claims that God knows everything. Typically, this is in the context of God watching the world. Watching the world is gaining information. But one is not going to find anything suggesting anything close to classical omniscience. Watch the proof text being used tonight. See if any of them even suggest this type of non-omniscience that we're talking about. None of them do. The biblical authors, they don't think in these categories. It's nowhere described in the text. So let's review the story of the Bible. God creates the world. He does this through speaking. He creates, he observes, and he evaluates thinking. God saw that it was good. God then creates man. His first act is to watch Adam to see what Adam will call the animals. He is curious. God is curious. He wants to know about man. Adam rebels against God. God has to change his plans for humanity. God expels man from his presence. The world soon becomes corrupt. God sees that the world has become wicked and regrets his own action in creating man. In the fashion of true regret, he undoes what he regrets doing. After worldwide destruction, God lowers his expectations for man. God learns that man's heart is evil from his youth. He starts creation anew. God still wants a relationship with mankind. This time he tries using a single family whom could act as a priest nation. God even expects them to be loyal. Yeah. In Genesis 18, we find God including Abraham in divine decision-making on this basis. In this text, God and Abraham discuss what God might find when he visits an evil city. The question is about justice. God adopts Abraham's higher standards. Abraham's family grows and soon finds themselves enslaved in Egypt. God calls Moses to be a spokesman to free Israel. Moses is afraid. He says Israel will not believe him. God gives him a cascading contingency plan if they don't believe. If they don't believe, do this. And if that doesn't work, do this. God is confident that the elders will accept Moses and help him confront Pharaoh. Spoiler, the elders don't. Moses still does not want to go. God tries and fails to convince Moses to be a spokesman. God gets angry and appoints Aaron instead. A reluctant Moses leads Israel out of captivity, but Israel quickly turns against God. God wants to kill them all and start over through Moses. Moses lays down a series of arguments and talks him out of it. God instead declares he needs to leave Israel, or else he might get so angry he's just going to kill them all. God offers to send an angel with Israel instead. Moses again talks him out of it. En route to the new promised land, God seeks to kill Israel multiple times. But as he's convinced otherwise. When people refuse to enter the promised land, God changes his plan yet again and leads them back into the wilderness for that generation to die. When Israel finally does reach the promised land, they forget God again. They engage in a cycle of apostasy. The people forget God. God inflicts punishment. They cry out in prayer. God forgives. This cycle repeats. At one point, God is fed up and he says he'll no longer forgive them. The people pray anyways. God forgives them. The people rebel against God's kingship and appoint a king. God, he chooses the new king, but soon regrets his decision. People change. God seeks out a new king. The kings are hit and miss, mostly miss. At one point, God declares against an evil king, Manasseh, but Josiah takes over and follows God. God delays the punishment intended for Manasseh until after Josiah is dead. The kingdoms decay in unbelief. God laments he's done everything he could do to reach them, and they still refuse. God expected them to be loyal, but only received sour grapes. The people are destroyed by first the Syrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians. God still attempts to reach Israel in their captivity, putting himself on trial and asking them to judge him. This does not appear to work. As in the wilderness, God keeps trying to destroy Israel and repenting to their cries. At one point, God gets tired of repenting and declares utter destruction against Israel. At another point, God just decides to forget Israel's sins for his own sake. It's just too much to deal with. God still wants to reach Israel, so he gets personal. He sends his only son to reform Israel. God says in Matthew 21:37, "They will respect my son," but they don't. They kill him. This does not thwart God's plans. Jesus is raised 3 days later, continues preaching the gospel of the kingdom. This gospel is explained by Jesus in the parable of the wedding feast. God has attempted to recruit the elite citizens of Israel. They reject him. He had to change his plan. He reached out to the masses. They did respond, some of them, but some not appropriately. Those who do respond and respond appropriately are chosen. Many are called, but few are chosen. But this is also difficult. The plan to reach Israel fails. Paul is called onto the scene. Perhaps if the Jews are broken off and the Gentiles grafted in, then God can finally have his people. Paul says God is using jealousy. Maybe by grafting in the Gentiles, God might save some of the Jews. Here we are today. The biblical history is a story of God's failed attempts to reach humanity. It's a story of God's frustration, of God's jealousy, his pain, his sorrow, his regret. The biblical picture of God is one of relation. To Israel, God is a person. You could talk to God, pray to God, change God's mind, affect God on an emotional level. God will often do things against his better judgment on account of our prayers. He accepts input and is willing to try new things. This is an entirely different God than the one of Greek philosophy, in which God is eternally simple and non-complex, ineffable, immutably static, in some sort of timeless state. To the Platonists and early Platonist Christians, all God's properties are identical with each other. For this to be true, God can't have a knowledge set that grows, changes, or even has dependencies. So here's our choice tonight. Does the Bible teach God as a person, or does the Bible teach God as some sort of transcendent, simplex substance? It should be fairly obvious to anyone who's familiar with the Bible which one of these are correct. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for that opening statement. All right, Jonathan, you're up for your 10-minute opening, and I will start your time as soon as you begin to speak.
All right. I first want to go off case here. I want to mention, just speaking about Chris's first thing here, that God interacting with mankind, events changing and circumstances changing, they all do happen and changes do occur based on what human beings do. But the main thing I want to say here just on the onset is that human free will is not shrouded in mystery to God, and God understands what people would do in any given situation because of the fact that God created the universe. He created man. He knows them. He says about Jeremiah that he knew him before he was even formed in the womb and already decided what his calling was going to be, that God knows what people will always do in any given situation. So these events as a web are truly unfolding, and many of those claims that the open theist makes are definitely true claims, but God already understands how they're going to unfold. So this really free will situation can be completely compatible with the situation of God being in control and knowing what mankind will always do because he understands them perfectly, just as a quick little shell right there. But let's go into the main case. My first point is that God has concrete and certain knowledge of counterfactuals, which means that foreknowledge of future free will decisions that are spoken of as 100% accuracies do disprove open theism, and we'll get to that one fallacy he spoke about later there. For example, in 1 Samuel 23, 10 through 12, God knew that a certain group of men would hand David over to Saul. In 1 Corinthians 2, 6 through 8, the rulers of this age would not have crucified the Lord of glory if they understood the hidden wisdom which Paul was speaking about. And in Matthew 11:20-24, a very famous proof text, Tyre, Sidon, and Sodom were said to have been in a state where repentance could have been achieved if certain miracles were performed there. We also know, interestingly enough, that in 1 Corinthians 10:13, God knows what a person can handle and what they can't handle, and he'll make sure that they're not given more than they can bear. So God understands the limits of free will, the limits of human decision making, and what they'll do perfectly in any given situation. Therefore, nothing is shrouded in mystery, and God can, to his glorification and his perfect glorification at that, let everything play out through free will decision making and still be sovereign, and at the same time perfectly know what people are going to do while still preserving a lot of what Chris Fisher was speaking about, a real narrative playing out that includes real people with real situations at play that are not puppets on a string. I want us to notice that different factors determine an outcome in both of our cases, and concrete cause and effect is in play. I think God's knowledge is sufficient right here to understand how every outcome is achieved, and that means that even while human decision making is free, because it's not shrouded in mystery, God can completely foreknow everything and people can still be free. Going to the second point, certain prophecy is too specific to be explained by open theism. In open theism, God either knows things by learning through experience or by unilaterally controlling a certain event that doesn't include violating free will, but many prophecies can't be explained by either category. So in Daniel 11:36-39, the Antichrist is said to not have regard for the love of women or for the gods of his fathers, and it speaks about later that he worships another certain god and sacrifices to that certain god as well. These are very specific free will decisions that this person in the future is going to make. And I don't believe that these things can be known under open theism, because open theists usually don't believe that God knew that they were even going to be born. And also they would usually accept that Jesus didn't know of people who weren't born yet when he died on the cross for their sins. And going to that same point, Isaiah 45 foretells of King Cyrus's future reign, which is a concrete historical event about a real future person, which I don't believe can be foreknown in open theism if God doesn't have a certain knowledge of future unborn human beings. There's also no way to explain the concrete and inerrant nature of the book of Revelation under open theism and many of the things included there because of how specifically world events are playing out, such as the mark of the beast and a one world government being implemented, as well as a concrete world scenario which includes real people making billions of decisions, each one altering the course of history. So since free will beings are unpredictable and can surprise God under open theism, concrete free will choices can't be foreknown, and concrete prophecy undermines open theism as well. Additionally, I think it's important to note a certain example like Jesus knowing that Judas would betray him. Acts 1:16 says, "The scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit foretold by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus." And John 13:11 says, "For he knew the one who was betraying him. It was for that reason that he said, 'Not all of you are clean.'" We can also use other examples of absolute certainties of future free will decisions, like Jesus knowing that Peter would betray him. And I think it's pretty obvious that God can see certain attributes that people have, and those, from a human perspective, we can see that that is how that is going to play out. Like if we're a human being and we're watching the situation, we'll know that Peter's weak and he's going to fold. God knew Peter perfectly before he was even born, and in his plan of the universe, he understood how that event would play out. Either of those perspectives, I believe, could refute an open theistic position. I also want to go to my third point, which states that open theism's conception of free will is incompatible with the Bible. I've seen quite a few open theists, and I believe every consistent open theist who really is true to that position would say that God has the ability to sin. And in my opinion, I believe they'd have to say that saved human beings have the ability to permanently apostatize even after the new heavens and the new earth. And I don't believe the Bible supports this, because Titus 1:2 says that God cannot lie, and even in the ESV it says God never lies. And James 1:13, a very famous example, states that God cannot even be tempted with evil. 1 John 1:5 also says that God is light and there's no darkness in him. And Jesus says in John 14:30 that the prince of this world has nothing in him. I want to emphasize that there isn't a capacity for God to sin. He has no evil in him. He would have to have evil in him, like when it says about Lucifer, iniquity was found in him, for him to have that ability. But I don't believe that God has that ability to sin because there is no evil in him. At the same time, while human beings do have a sort of free will, I don't believe it's this unlimited open theist free will. 1 Corinthians 1:8 says that Jesus Christ will sustain Christians as guiltless to the end. And 1 Thessalonians 5:23 through 24 says that God will keep the believer's spirit, soul, and body blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. So even though they have free will, it's still the certainty that God is going to preserve these people and he's going to guard and protect them. And that shouldn't be seen as a violation of the person's will, but at the same time, God can sovereignly control events, even with people having free will, and perfectly foreknow and to an extent control what is going to happen in the future. The last point here is refuting open theism's proof text as much as I can in 3 more minutes. I believe a lot of open theism's most common and mainstream proof texts are God regretting his own actions and God not knowing what human beings will do. So when we go to Genesis 6 and 1 Samuel 15, which are God regretting making a man and regretting making Saul king, I believe that the open theist position is self-contradictory here, because I don't think from the perspective of an open theist that God would have been at fault in this worldview of taking a risk in making mankind, and couldn't even be blamed for not knowing the full range of outcomes or probability that, like Saul would do as king as well, like his rebellion. So when looking at mankind's rebellion and Saul's future disobedience, I don't believe that there's any good explanation as to why God would look back in an open theist worldview and say, oh, that was my fault. I did something wrong. If God is taking a risk and he's truly taking a chance, I don't think there should be any language or any open theist argument that would say that the Bible says that God is regretting a certain thing. And especially when it's a world of chance and risk. We know that this term could be that God is sighing deeply, that he is grieved at something, but it doesn't mean that he regretted his own action here. Also, a lot of open theists would state that God lacks a lot of present knowledge, and I don't think that this is biblically accurate, because 1 Chronicles 28:9 says that God searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. And 1 John 3:20 says that God knows all things, and that's in context to the human heart, and I think the human condition as well. So since nothing is hidden from God, he always knew, for example, that Abraham would obey him in Genesis 22. Hebrews 11:19 confirms this, because it says Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead if Abraham killed him. And also Romans 4:20 through 22 says that Abraham never wavered in faith and was fully convinced of God's faithfulness to the promise. Now, lastly, I want to go over in this last minute that a lot of open theism proof texts are about God not knowing that certain people would sin, a certain sin or certain situation not entering his mind, or God expecting people to turn back but not. There are multiple ways those can be interpreted, but I don't believe the open theist interpretation is a good one, because Deuteronomy 31:16 through 18 has the Lord telling Moses that in the future, the Israelites are going to play the prostitute with the foreign gods of the land in the midst of which they are going, and they're going to abandon him and break his covenant, and then his anger is going to be kindled against them, which means that God already 100% knew that the Israelites were going to, in a major way, disobey God and apostatize from him and break his commandments. If open theism was true, then I believe that the correct perspective would be that God doesn't know what's going to happen, but he, I think, would at least be hopeful that these people are going to be faithful. But look at this, in Deuteronomy 31, God already knows. He already understands what's going to occur. And ultimately, we see that many times in the Bible in many different situations. And Lord willing, we can get into that a little bit later. But that's the intro for right now, guys. Again, thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you so much for those introduction, guys. Next round we're going to go to is rebuttal rounds. So, Chris, you are back in the saddle. And I'll start your time. 5-minute rebuttals, by the way. I'll start your time when you begin to speak. I think you're muted, Chris.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very interesting opening. I'd like to point out the fact that we already talked about what open theism is. It's a denial of classical omniscience. And one of the factors of classical omniscience is God's knowledge can't be dependent. So every time Jonathan Singleton was talking about how God's thought process is dependent on how he thinks about us and what he knows about us, and his actions and thoughts are based on mankind, this is a dependent knowledge. This is a knowledge that is gained from outside of himself. This is a changing knowledge set. Even when Jonathan Singleton talks about, oh, God decided this. Deciding is a thought process. This is thinking. This is discursive knowledge. This is change within the divine data set when you have this type of dependent knowledge. And so he sounded like for most of that he was arguing my position, which is pretty interesting. He stated that God has all these prophecies that are 100% decided, but God tells us that that's not the case. You know, God sometimes expects one thing to happen, even things that he's going to do that don't materialize. So one of the cases is 1 Samuel 2:30. Therefore the Lord declares, I had promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now, declares the Lord, far be it from me. He's saying my own promise that you'd be my everlasting house, far be it from me. For those who honor me, I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. He switches a unilateral promise to a conditional promise based on their actions. And this is just playing out what is described in Jeremiah 18. He says, the instant I speak this concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to pluck it up, to pull it down, to destroy it, if that nation against whom I've spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I thought to do to it. So God knows that his plans change based on current circumstances, but the non-open theists are very concerned and very afraid of this actually playing out in reality. So let's talk a little bit about proof text and bad proof texting. We already talked about the fallacy of composition. For example, God knowing one or multiple things about the future does not mean God knows all things about the future. It certainly does not mean that God has innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions. Let's talk about begging the question, assuming what you're trying to prove, quoting out of context phrases as if they innately support whatever claims are being presented. For example, omniscience claims. God knows all things. Yeah. People come across this phrase and say, oh yeah, this means my specific understanding of omniscience. Well, believers know all things. 1 John 2:20, they understand all things. Proverbs 28:5, they're filled with all knowledge. Romans 15:14, they know things perfectly from the beginning. Luke 1:3, King David knows all the things of the earth. 2 Samuel 14:20, the writer of Ecclesiastes has seen all works under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1:14, no secret can be hidden from the Prince of Tyre. Ezekiel 28:3. This is just like normal language applied to normal human beings. It doesn't inherently mean their idea of omniscience. One will notice quite often that the same phrases used about man, when used about God, somehow gain some sort of super specific metaphysics. This is a form of special pleading. These people advocating this, they don't actually have reasons why their specific phrase means their metaphysics. They're just desperate for proof text. Their proof texts do not exist. Real biblical scholarship involves searching the immediate context to give meaning to chance phrases. If God or man knows all things, what exactly does the context suggest? Narratives are particularly better suited to this task than disjointed phrases. Phrases by themselves have almost an unlimited range of meaning. In a narrative, the proof text needs to be connected to the overall plot. It must give meaning and have explanatory power. God repenting in Genesis 6 drives the action. It explains what is happening and why. It gives motivation. So let's talk about truth making by storytelling. If one talks long enough about a verse, then it must mean whatever the verse is saying. Jonathan has an interesting video called The Best Passage to Disprove Open Theism. He spends 3 minutes talking about Deuteronomy 30, and somehow it proves classical omniscience. One of his friends, his bros, in the comments, he points out that the immediate context explains how God knows the future. It says, quote, for I know the inclination of their behavior today, even before I brought them into the land which I swore to them. God knows how they will act based on how they're acting now. This is a proof text for open theism. God is seeing and he's deciding, he's doing a mental process to predict the future. That's what's described in the text. That's the mechanism. Context gives meaning, not elaborate stories. Notice how confidently titled that video was when in fact it's an open theist proof text. It's not often that in a debate that someone's own proof texts are evidence against their own position, but when we're debating open theism, it happens all the time. Talking briefly about prophecy, we talked about that a little bit in his opening. It's like sometimes prophecy, it's made to be subverted, right? Sometimes there's prophecies that aren't, and he pointed out some of them. I got like 5 seconds left. But often when it comes to prophecy, you'll see a fallacy of argument from incredulity. We don't know how God would do this unless he had our type of classical omniscience. But that's an argument from incredulity. It's a fallacy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chris, for that rebuttal. All right, Jonathan, you're back in the seat for your 5-minute rebuttal, and I'll start your time when you begin to speak.
All right, awesome. The first thing that I want to mention right here that's really important is I strongly believe that any claim that would be made, and that I believe was made by Chris Fisher, that God is learning in the present and doesn't know said information prior, would be a denial of perfect past knowledge. So if we have a situation where God doesn't have foreknowledge, or he doesn't already perfectly know based on all existing factors what would happen in the future, that being said, I believe that God would absolutely be able to always see everything, which I don't believe an open theist could also claim. We get here that there is a denial of perfect past knowledge if God is like always scanning the earth, scanning the universe to see what's going on, and wouldn't be able to always know everything that is happening. But again, the position that I'm putting forth is that because God created the universe and perfectly knows everything that was put into effect and perfectly knows everything he planned, the only factor that could possibly be a variable to not perfectly know everything that was going to occur would be if mankind had a free will that was shrouded in mystery. And this is precisely why I wanted to mention this right at the beginning, that even though people are free to do like what they want to do in their range of, desire, it doesn't mean that people are going to be having some kind of quality that God can't see, perfectly know, and understand even before they are born. The only standard for saying that there's another position that is good that denies open theism is just even to say, like, the bare minimum, God will perfectly know everything that is ever going to happen prior to it occurring. That's one thing that is really important. So when we get to an issue like testing, like Chris Fisher saying that God is testing to know, a lot of the time God knows the heart and would already perfectly know what's going to go on because he already knew what the condition of the person's heart was going to be prior. But at the same time, like, we get examples of God seeing and testing the Israelites every single day by letting them get manna from heaven every single day. But then at the same time, there are other examples like Abraham being tested to see if he's faithful in Genesis 22. Well, when would a test like that expire? When does God have to test him again? And how long is God's knowledge legitimate if he's actually having to test to know when he's only learning in the present? And how much past knowledge is not being gained by God because he only has a certain limitation of what he's learning in the present? Those are a lot of the questions I want to put forth when people are examining this topic, and why God having a perfect foreknowledge and having all of the omnis and ims just makes the most sense when going over the biblical narrative. Now, I definitely want to hit the fallacy of composition right now. It's very important. When we're talking about this topic, it is very, very important to understand that when we point to examples like Jesus knowing Judas would betray him, the Antichrist in Daniel 11, like for sure worshiping a certain God, denying other ones, and not having the love of women, all of these examples like this, and all of the counterfactuals that were named, like the men of Keilah being able to, 100%, like God knowing 100%, they would hand David over to Saul. If certain future things can be foreknown, and they include future free will decisions, I don't believe there's any legitimate way we can say that God knows certain future free will decisions and doesn't know others. Let's get to the meat of it. Let's get right to the heart of this issue once and forever now. If God can foreknow any future free will decision, what kind of capacity do we have to say that he can't learn other ones? That is the main question I want everyone to examine today. So when we're going over like this supposed fallacy of composition, if God can know for sure a future free will decision, why can't he know another one? That's the main question that I really want to go over. And going over some of this case as well, when it comes to the entire book of Revelation and those certain things in Daniel, I don't really believe there was enough put forth by Chris Fisher to dismiss how these very specific things could be foreknown to a certainty unless God does have exhaustive foreknowledge. At the same time, I also want to, let's see, what other example? Oh yeah, he mentions Deuteronomy 31. The reason why I want to mention that is because it just refutes so many other supposed open theism proof texts. And it's important to understand that God isn't taking a guess in the words of scripture are not in probability, especially right here. It's not like God's wondering if his people are going to betray him. He knows it as a fact. He's telling this to Moses as a fact. So because he knows that, we know that he foreknows this before it occurs, that free will isn't shrouded in mystery and God isn't like going to be wrong about this certain thing. Let's see what else I wanted to hit here. There was one more thing. Oh yeah, when he talks about a certain promise becoming conditional instead of unconditional, if the promise, like in 1 Samuel 2:30, I think it's pretty obvious here, to be honest, that this is always a conditional claim, because if it can be changed, it can't go from unconditional to conditional. It was just always conditional. And in Jeremiah 18, I agree that God reacts based on what people will do from our perspective. But I believe that God already knows the full, like I said in the very beginning, the full web, the full chain of events that was going to occur. Thus, he's still sovereign over them, and people are still making free decisions. Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you so much for those opening and rebuttals. And now we're going to transition to the real meat of every debate, the cross X, right? All right, so cross X, once again, is going to be 40-minute cross X. Both of you get 20 minutes each to ask questions. If you can answer the question with just a yes or no, please do that. You don't want to drain your opponent's time. Let's keep it a dialogue. Let's not get into a monologue. This is not the time for preaching, all right? That said, Chris, you're up first for your 20-minute cross X. So Jonathan.
All right, Deuteronomy 8:2. You shall remember the Lord your God, who's led you all this way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Are there any dependent clauses, any adverbial clauses, or prepositional phrases in this verse that tells us why God tested Israel?
I believe that from an open theist perspective, you can read it the way that you're saying. I just believe it can be read either way, because when something's being given to humans for a human perspective, they're stating that, and I don't want to drain too much of your time, but I just basically believe that when you're speaking to human beings, God could say, like, I'm looking to know if you're really going to do this or that. But I think the overall, I guess, God sees the heart. God, he knows all things as far as your heart. God already does know. It's kind of like in Genesis 3 when he says, where are you? But he's drawing information out, but he already knows the information.
He's drawing information out. That sounds like learning, right?
From our perspective, it would be learning. But when he's asking, and if I'm going too long, just stop me. But when he's asking the question, like even in Genesis, he knows.
I didn't catch your answer. So there is a dependent clause in that verse that explains why God tested Israel, right? There's a dependent clause in there.
Yeah, I believe that you can read it like that. I believe these verses from either God or man's perspective could be read either way. Depending on what your presuppositions are, I think it could be read either way.
Right. So what's the reason, according to the verse, why God tested Israel?
Let's see. From what you said about the verse, trying to remember it, something like knowing
to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not.
Is that the reason? Yeah, I believe that the verse says that, and I do believe that God's drawing out what is in man. But what I'm saying at the same time is that God does understand the human heart and know what is in people, and sometimes he draws that out in order either to judge them or to bless them, depending on the given situation.
So do you believe the author of Deuteronomy 8:2 believe that God has innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions? You believe the author believed that?
I still believe that he believed that God's knowledge is perfect. I don't see anywhere where that would be contradicted still.
Is there anything in the context of Deuteronomy 8 that leads you to this conclusion?
Just from one verse, from looking at it like that, I believe that this is
like anywhere in Deuteronomy 8. Do you know of anywhere in Deuteronomy 8 that leads you to the conclusion?
I'm not saying I know the whole chapter off the top of my head. I mean, I wish I did.
That's fine. You could just say, I don't know of any, right?
No, not of
Exodus.
that chapter.
Yeah, Exodus 32:9, Lord says to Moses, I've seen this people, and behold, stiff-necked people, therefore let me alone. In my wrath that may burn hot against them, I may consume them. But Moses implored the Lord and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent he did bring them out, to kill them in the mountains, to consume them? Turn from your burning anger and relented the disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'll multiply your offspring. I'm kind of skipping through for time's sake. Yeah. And the Lord repented of the disaster he had spoken of bringing to his people. Does this passage describe God listening to Moses?
I believe it does, and I also believe that God does act based on what people will do. But to fully answer the question, I believe God is drawing Moses to act in basically being a type of Christ for these people. I believe that God already did know that killing the Israelites would look bad in front of the Egyptians. I don't believe that's like a learned piece of information, but I believe it is still the reason why he acted. I think you can go.
Yeah, you believe Moses wrote this, right? Exodus 32.
Yeah.
So does Moses believe that he affected God, that he gave God input and God listened to him?
I believe that his intercession did cause God to act, but I think God drew him to intercede. You get what I mean? Like there's a reason prior to
Yeah,
the whole
that's
situation
dependent knowledge,
going on.
right? Is that dependent knowledge? Is God's decision making dependent on Moses?
Are, are you asking it's if it's in reference to him like learning a piece of information from Moses? Because I
No,
wouldn't say that it.
is God's actions dependent on Moses? What God does is dependent on input that Moses gives from outside of God.
I think you could say yes to an extent, but not in the sense that God is learning a new piece of information. It's the act of interceding that God is honoring from Moses, but it's not learning a new argument. Otherwise, like that would go against like a natural knowledge claim, which I don't think either position would really do. That's my
Right.
opinion.
So denial of even present knowledge, that would be an affirmation of open theism, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
Right. So Moses talks about this later. Deuteronomy 19, he says, "For I was afraid of the anger and hot displeasure with the Lord was angry with you to destroy you, but the Lord listened to me at that time also." So does Moses here describe God accepting input from him?
Can you read that one more time?
"For I was afraid of the anger and hot displeasure with which the Lord was angry with you to destroy you." So this is looking back at Exodus 32. "But the Lord listened to me at that time also." Does Moses believe that God accepted input from him?
I believe that God listened to Moses. Like, I definitely believe even the way that that verse is phrased. But I think that we're looking at it from two different perspectives of, did God have the argument in his mind that Moses was giving him prior, or was God wanting Moses to intercede in order for that to be the reason that he saved the people? So
Yeah,
that's why I believe
we'll get to
we
the
both say,
reasons.
sure.
Does this passage describe a God not destroying Israel because of Moses' intercession?
Yeah,
Exodus
I
32,
affirm
does
that.
that passage?
I definitely affirm that. And I think the whole time I've been affirming that for sure. Like
Yeah,
that
which is
God.
interesting because that's dependent knowledge, and that's open theism. If God is accepting input from outside himself, that's learned and acquired knowledge, right?
I don't think
It's
that would be
dependent
learned in the
knowledge.
car. That's where I disagree with you right there. That's where I would
Yeah.
disagree. I don't think that God is learning a new piece of information, but I believe that God has attributed value to interaction with mankind, and He wanted to save them from Moses' intercession. That's why He drew him to want to intercede.
Right. Psalms 106:23 is also looking back at the same event. It says, "Therefore he said he would destroy them." Did that happen? God said he's going to destroy them. It doesn't happen, right? Did God destroy them?
Yeah, I agree that that doesn't happen. Yeah,
Had
it doesn't.
not Moses, his chosen one, stood before him in the breach. And so the author of Psalms 106, he believes the reason God didn't destroy Israel was because of Moses. Is that correct?
I agree with that. Like I've said the last two times, I definitely
Okay.
do think that the
So is
intercession
there
was the real intercession that saved
what
Israel.
particular argument in Exodus 32 was the reason that God decided not to destroy Israel?
I think we both know the answer to that. That it is because it's referenced in Ezekiel, talking about how God didn't want to kill the Israelites because it would basically make him look bad to pagan nations. So I do believe that that reason was in both Moses's and God's mind. Like I think it's a valid claim as to why he didn't destroy Israel. We're just disagreeing about if God already knew that that was a reason prior to Moses saying it, or if Moses saying it was like the light bulb, right? If
So
I'm not mistaken, like you can correct
So
that
we
if I'm
got
wrong.
verses that say God repented. We got verses that say Moses is the reason for this. We got verses that say it was for the specific arguments that Moses gave. Do you believe that any of these authors believe that God has innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions? You believe
I,
any of
I
those
don't
authors believe that?
I don't think that these are claims against that. I believe that they're saying that Moses had a real intercession that saved Israel, which I affirm, and I even think it was for those reasons. What we're talking about is whether God knew those reasons prior to Moses bringing them up, because you're mentioning if the input, it's like you're mentioning it from the perspective of did this input save Israel, or was it the act of Moses interceding that
So
God honored? So
those are
that's what we're
categories. Those are categories you're making. Is there any evidence contextually why the author of Exodus 32 had that context in mind? Is there
I don't think
anything in Exodus 32 that describes what you're describing here?
I don't think either of the specific perspectives are mentioned. We're both just looking at it like, okay, how does this fit in? And I think that there are implications on your view that are harder to accept. and that either way you could say that Moses' intercession was the act that saved Israel.
So,
Like,
so
because
your
this would
claim
be like, yeah, sorry, it's your concept.
is your claim that Moses believed that God has ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable of all knowledge of all propositions? As he's writing this, as he's interacting with God, as he's arguing with him on Mount Sinai, this is the type of God and God's knowledge that he has in mind?
I still think he believes that, even though God is relational and that there is a real dialogue there and there is a real saving of Israel there. I do believe that Moses understands that God does have a perfect knowledge of all things and even knew exactly how the interaction would go prior to it happening. But one thing I want to say too is when Moses is in the moment and he sees that, God has this anger and he's like, okay, I have to save these people. I mean, that's a real dialogue right there. And Moses was feeling a lot of emotion there. So it's hard to look at a situation without actually like seeing exactly all the factors at play. So we're basically just doing our best to put the pieces together with that.
Right, but there's nothing in context that suggests you're reading, no?
I believe both of our both of our conclusions are inferred, but there are certain proof texts either of us could use to try to make it look like our view is biblical. I still think my view could
like if you brought this to people, if you brought this passage to people who knew nothing about the Bible, would any of them come up with your conclusion?
I don't think it's a proof text either way. You know what I mean? I don't think like
you don't think they'll
our positions.
You don't think that if we brought this to 10 random people who know nothing about the Bible, they won't say God changed his mind here?
I think that they would say that God acted because Moses interceded. Like, I definitely think they would affirm that.
You don't think that they would say that God changed his mind?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, that's why I asked. That was the question.
Sure. I think that
how many of them?
I think that all of them would say that God changed what he was going to do. But when you're talking about changing his mind, there are different implications from an open theist perspective of changing their mind. So
argument from implication is a fallacy, right?
Are you saying I'm doing that right now? Is that what's going on?
You did in some of your opening. You can explore it on your time, but I have heard you make some arguments from implication, which is a fallacy. So tell me, what is your best proof text or passage to show that God has ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions, past, present, and future? What's your best proof text?
Well, the argument that I think is the strongest would be, especially in any given. Yeah, so I think multiple can fit into it. I don't want to put one as like it's the best, but I think any category.
Well, we got 8 minutes, so just grab one. The debate's about is open theism biblical. So what's your best biblical evidence that you want to talk about right now that you could defend?
I would want to talk about either Daniel 11 or Revelation stating very specific events that God wouldn't be able to know just from like learning in the present through experience or by unilaterally bringing a situation about. Like we could talk about the book of Revelation in general.
I interviewed Greg Boyd, and he stated for some time he was an open theist Calvinist. In that sense, he believed that God predestined all things, controlled all. We don't really have that free will, libertarian free will, but God still has the capacity to learn and experience and change. And so what precludes God from taking away everyone's free will for Daniel 11, what we'll say, and open theism still being true?
I think that open theism, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to state that God doesn't violate mankind's free will because free will and ability are different. Free will and ability are different.
I defined open theism in the opening statement. And it's a denial of classical omniscience. It's not about man. If God could have created all robots everywhere, right? And open theism still could be true if God can think, if God can create, if God doesn't have unfalsifiable knowledge about the future. So Daniel 11, God stating a series of events is your best proof text for ungenerated knowledge. How does that show ungenerated knowledge? What if God decided to do that at some time?
Well, what I mentioned in the beginning of my first speech is the criteria of how God's learning in open theism, and that if a certain piece of information doesn't fit in either of those categories, which would be a unilateral action or learning through experience, then it would have to be chalked up that this is the type of knowledge that you're talking about, like ungenerated, unfalsifiable knowledge. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so that's something that I tried to hit early. so that
I,
that
I
could be a
don't
talking point.
I don't see. Well, again, the question was, what is your best passage to show that God has innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions, past, present, and future? And you just showed me a text that lists some events that are going to happen in the future. I don't see how that leads to innate knowledge. Maybe this is knowledge that God came up with at some time and then forced to happen. I don't see how it's ungenerated. Maybe God thought through this and generated this decision tree, right? It's not non-discursive. Maybe God made a decision about this at some point. I don't see how it's eternal. Is there some sort of like a simple eternal knowledge of this that you're seeing in the text somewhere? I'm not.
Well,
And
well, here's
unfalsifiable.
the different thing that I explained earlier that I don't think's been addressed either is that God can know a full web and chain of events, but that no factor is outside of his control. So due to the fact that human beings have free will, but God still fully knows them, he can direct the way that history is going to go. So what I'm saying is that the reason why something like Daniel 11 would be a good proof text against open theism is that the only way that God can know something in open theism would be like a unilateral power act, or if God is learning through experience, because he's still
Right.
having to interact with free will, which is a variable. So what I'm saying is that there's a
I'm saying
of
free
this,
will doesn't have to exist, right? Open theism is not dependent on free will to exist. And so how does this passage prove that God has innate knowledge?
I mean,
Innate.
I'm not
That's
going to
just part
tell
of his
you like
character.
I'm not going to tell you like what you have to believe or not believe, but I would strongly believe that 99% of open theists would definitely say that mankind does have a free will, and the only way that there is and here's why I would link it to say it is a part of open theism, and I'm not
No,
like
we defined open theism. If God has free will, open theism's true, right? If God can do new things, think new thoughts, make new creations, open theism's true, regardless if mankind exists. Is that right?
But
Correct?
what I'm saying about the other arguments of open theism is that the reason why there are like errors and risks and mistakes is because of the fact that human beings have this will that is somewhat shrouded in mystery. So all of those other proof texts are not going to make sense if God is, controlling people with
Right.
nanobots.
But I did ask you what your best evidence is for innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions past, present, and future.
Yeah,
I
correct.
don't see you defending any one of those adjectives with your proof text.
Well,
I don't see the proof text actually proving any single one of those.
well, the reason why it does prove those is because in any open theist position, as I said, God would either have to be doing something unilaterally or it'd be learning through experience. Hence the reason why
All right.
there are so many things that got like
Okay,
there are reasons why God is surprised by so many things. It's because of that variable of human free will. So
this was your best proof text, right?
what I'm saying is
Oh,
it's the best category. I'm not trying to like exalt one proof text over another. I'm saying the best
yeah,
category against
that's
open
interesting.
theism is
So in
so like,
Jeremiah 18, God sends Jeremiah down to the potter's house. He sees a potter, and the potter's making a vessel. And it says the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another vessel. So in the parable of the potter and the clay, does the potter, who's identified with God later, does he finish what he originally intended to do?
I agree it was marred in the potter's hand and he made something new out of
Did
it. And again, like
did he finish
I,
what he originally intended? I could
I
read it
would say,
again.
no, I got
The
it. I think that it got marred and he made something different. It wasn't
Okay,
the
so he
they.
did not accomplish. Did he
It's not
accomplish
about.
what he originally tried to do?
I don't think it's about God failing in a certain situation. I think
Right.
it's that a person
That
did
might be the
something
case.
and then God is saying, I'm going to do something else because you did this, which I agree that that happens all the time in the
So
Bible. All I'm saying is because God understands what people are going to do, he understands how the course of human history will change. Hence the
all right,
entire like web
just
God knows, which I said in the
how
beginning.
about just in Jeremiah 18:4, did the potter finish what he originally attempted to do? Like the vessel
I
he was
would,
making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he worked it into another vessel. Did he finish his original attempt?
I would say no. I think
Okay.
that, but that fits with both perspectives because God understands the way that events are going to go, and He can change what's going to happen based on what people do. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't have an assumption that God didn't know that that was going to happen. but I agree that the
Right.
original was not
So this
achieved.
is
Yeah, I
nice.
agree.
It does explain the parable, right? So later on it says, the instant I speak concerning a nation, concerning a kingdom, to pluck it up, to pull it down, to destroy it, if that nation against whom I've spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I thought to bring upon it. You just said that you don't think it means that God didn't know this was going to happen, that he was thinking one thing would happen and another. But it seems here in Jeremiah 18 that he says he did think he was going to do that and then doesn't do that. So in Jeremiah 18:8, what is thought to do? Thought to bring upon it. What does that mean?
I would say it's God's original intention. So he's saying, this is what I would like for you. But I believe at the same time, he understands the way that they are going to sin. So he's not going to honor people who are sinning against him, and he's going to change that plan. But what I'm
So
saying is that he like does understand future free will decisions perfectly. Thus, he understood how things would change in the course of history. But I still agree
so
with
they are using the same word though that you used. You said God knows this is going to happen, and then he says, "I thought to bring it upon." They're using the same
I
language you
believe
just
I
used,
believe
right?
he's using God as his intention. Like God can have an ideal plan, if that makes sense, of what he wants to happen. But I believe human beings can mess up and God will have to change what he's going to do. But I just believe God knew the way that would go.
All right.
All right.
All right. Good job. All right, Jonathan, you're up next for your 20-minute cross examination of Chris.
All righty. Let's see. Okay. I'll wait till the time starts and then I'll just go for it. Okay, perfect. Okay, Chris, do you believe that God knows himself exhaustively?
He knows himself exhaustively.
Mhm.
I'm not
Like all
sure
of
what
his
exactly that means.
Okay, so I would say it would mean all of his desires and thoughts and intentions and plans of what he would want to do in the future. Does he know all of that about himself exhaustively? Everything he wants to do and every attribute about himself?
I This is a debate about is open theism biblical, and I don't know of any biblical support for that claim.
Okay, well, the way that it's linking is because of the fact that in open theism, because God is learning things through experience and that he's like, in time with us as well, along the way as people are changing, because you wouldn't believe in impassibility, that God can learn new things about himself and he could have new intentions and desires. That's the way that I believe it inherently does link to the topic. And that's why I was asking that question.
Yeah,
So
well, you do see evidence of God lowering his standards when
Mhm.
confronted with a fallen humanity. And this is pointed out in David Klein's Fall of the Flood, in which the same reason that God destroys the world, he decides never to destroy the world again, because evil is in man's heart from their youth. And so it's God learning about mankind and adjusting his standards accordingly. We see another standards adjustment in Genesis 18, in which Moses talks to God about Sodom and argues him down about the amount of righteousness inherent in collateral damage.
So, what information based on that do you believe that God actually had, as far as natural knowledge about free will prior to the creation of the universe?
So, what's natural knowledge? What do you mean by that phrase?
Um, okay, did God understand free will as like this, like as a concept that's fully known in his mind, like the full limits of human decision making and everything that a human being could do or want or think or desire? Did God have all of that knowledge within himself prior to making mankind?
It doesn't seem like that. It doesn't seem in the Bible that free will's like even a consideration within God. Like, oh, do I create a being with free will? Free will is just a given. It's there's not a category in which people don't have individual volition, and God learns about man through creation. His first act is to watch Adam to see what Adam's going to name the animals. It's curious. He's like, okay, I made this new creation. What are they going to do? It's so
I
I
think
don't
that
see that.
Okay, I think you may run into a grounding issue here, because if God is making a free will creature and he's designing them to have free will, where does this information that he may not know about as far as the limits of free will come from? Like, where would that unknown factor come from if it didn't have anything to do with the way that God created the person?
Again, I don't think free will is like a category. I think that's a modern category that we assign. God did not have a active thought process as if I can make robots or someone with volition and free will and what are all their choices. You don't see that discussion in the Bible.
quickly. So, are you saying that God didn't have a plan of creating a free will being? Like he wasn't making that as a part of the creation. Like that just wasn't something that
It
he.
wasn't like an
Oh,
option. It was just inherent in his creation. It didn't seem like an active choice. That's something that he chooses to do rather than make a being without free will. Free will is not
that seems like
like
an assumption.
a,
That seems like an assumption, though, right? Like that kind of seems like an assumption because
well, you
I
see
think
God learning about man throughout the Bible, right?
what I'm saying is that with that learning comes an issue of grounding. Where does that information that God is learning, like where did that concrete matter come from if it didn't come from God creating the person? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I don't see how these are biblical categories. They sound like philosophical categories, and I don't think any biblical author would entertain this question
The,
categorically.
the reason why they should and why you should is because
Well,
in the
yeah,
Bible, I'll explain it.
yeah, go ahead.
Because
Yeah.
so I'm not trying to get cute or anything. Like in the Bible, there are so many times where according to an open theist position, God's like, okay, didn't know that mankind was going to get so evil after the fall and like having to punish mankind with the flood, or not knowing that Saul was going to disobey, thus regretting that action. What I'm saying is that there is this inherent nature of whether you want to call it free will or not, there's some factor that God created that is within humanity that makes it to where their actions are uncertain. And so if God did not put that there, then where did it come from is my question.
I don't think he had an option not to create it. It's not a thing. I think we're thinking in Platonistic categories and not Semitic categories here.
The reason why I
Like
would say
well, yeah, is this biblical? The question is open theism biblical? And you're
no.
talking categories. I don't find discussions of this in the Bible. I don't find them going through what you're describing here, their thought process. I don't think any author of the Bible thinks like you.
Well, the reason why it's being brought up is because of the fact that there are so many times within how open theists explain the Bible, there's a lot of God not knowing what people are going to do, that frustration of not understanding certainties. And that's why I'm mentioning this factor, because it is so relevant within the relational nature of how mankind and God interact. That's why I don't think it's just a Platonistic category. I think it's a reality in much of the interaction between God and man, just to
So if
explain
they,
why I believe it is a biblical category, if that makes sense.
yeah, but I don't see anyone in the Bible talking like this or in these categories. So I don't think it's a biblical category or biblical philosophy you're talking about.
You just don't want to answer. Like, I'm not saying you don't know how to
No,
answer the
like,
questions. I think you do, but you're just saying you don't want to engage in those particular questions.
oh, what would my answer be? Can you entertain me?
Sure. So if I were to say, where did this come from? I mean, it would either like I would have to say it would be a topic of grounding. So like if there's a certain factor that God didn't know existed in mankind, where did that come from? I think that any position would have to say that this is something that at least God allowed for. Even if he didn't make it some necessary component of mankind, maybe he knew that this was something that could occur within mankind, or that mankind could become this way. And thus, I would ask, like, why did he, next, I would ask, why did he include this within the nature of mankind? And why did he want to interact with mankind in this way? And I believe that's biblically based in the interactions between God and mankind, according to an open theist being so uncertain. And that's why I don't think there's this like violation where it's just philosophy.
Yeah, I just don't. When I look at the creation account in Genesis, I don't see God having this as some sort of concern that's relevant or even a consideration during the creation. God just creates man, and then he's like, okay, now we'll see what man does. He just learns about man.
So then you would say prior to the creation that God didn't know if this was going to be a successful endeavor, right? Like he didn't know if he could accomplish any of his given plans prior to creating mankind because he didn't know that whole.
He seems to have expected it, but when he regrets his own decision, he seems to be blaming himself. I know in your opening you said, it would result in God blaming himself. I think he is putting some blame on himself for the state of affairs and how bad mankind has gotten.
But like what you said before, if God isn't making this or didn't intend or didn't have a specific plan to make mankind in this way, I think there's a ton of issue with saying that God regretted his action. Because if you're saying it's not this, like what we were saying in those first 10 minutes, if this isn't something that God specifically planned for, why is God to blame for it? And why would he blame himself for it?
Because you could blame yourself for all sorts of things that is through your own maybe negligence, we'll say. If I hand my kid a loaded gun.
Yeah, I'll let you finish it. Go for it.
Yeah, so if this was, let's say this is a case of divine negligence, open theism would be true, right?
Is that what you're saying it is?
He's blaming himself, and so he's taking responsibility for his actions. And yes, and so sometimes you will see God blaming himself or other people blaming God for ills in this world. And
do you think there's ever, if I could interject, do you think there's ever an example of a person legitimately blaming God for anything in the Bible?
Yeah, and like Jeremiah.
Which example?
Job got really tortured. He didn't deserve it. That's the whole point of Job, is that Job was innocent of all these things, and the divine bet going on was whether or not he would remain righteous for nothing. He's described as perfect in the text, and this is not about him or about his character, and he's just getting thrown around and tossed around and pummeled. That doesn't seem very nice. That seems a little unjust.
What are the implications of God's character in your view based on what you're describing? Because that's what my next question would be. Like, what are you concluding about God and his character through the examples that you're naming? If you're saying that these actions that mankind is blaming God for, they're like these legitimate claims against God.
Right. I don't think sin is a metaphysical substance or reality. And so sin is, in the Hebrew Bible, there's a paper that talks about the concept of Hebrew sin in the Bible, and it's whatever puts you in wrong with another person. And so even if it's something very petty, let's say I'd write a contract for land and or something like that, and I just violate my side of the contract, even if there's no morality involved, I'm putting myself in wrong with someone else, right? And so we do see times within the Bible which God has put in a state of wrongness in relation to other people. And so it's a subjective evaluation. The people certainly think they're getting violated at that point in time. Whether you or I consider that a violation, that's our own prerogative. But I don't think sin is a metaphysics, like a yes-no switch where you could just say, oh yeah, that's God sinning. But you can say, hey, these people who loved God, who served God, they're in the Bible, they write the Bible, they think they're being wronged by God.
I guess what I'm asking
you is,
in your opinion then, because I get what you're saying, in your opinion, do you look at any of these claims that people are making against God and you're saying God did something in this situation that should not have been done? Is that what you're claiming?
Well, yeah, I don't think God should have killed King David's baby for his adultery. I just don't. I don't think he should have done that. And you find within the Bible, I posted a lecture by Christine Hayes, who I mentioned already, about divine law in the Bible. And Jewish and Talmudic texts reinforce this idea that you can reason with God, you could talk to God about standards of righteousness, and sometimes he listens to his people and adjusts what he does based on their input. I think Genesis 18 is a pretty good case of God changing his standards of righteousness based on input from outside himself. And so I think those are...
I'll stop you right there real quick.
Yeah, I don't want to kill all your time.
Oh no, you're doing fine. It's fine. I'm trying to think of my next question. With that point, what are your implications personally with God's nature if you believe that God did things that he shouldn't have done? Like, how do you view under this particular open theist perspective of God's nature and character if you're looking at certain things that he's doing and you're saying, well, these are not things that should have been done? Like, are there implications that you have toward your view of God and that open theism would have toward God due to these implications that you're bringing forth?
Right. We see in the Psalms a very practical response. The Bible is all about practicality and not metaphysics. And so King David, when he thinks he's being wronged or abandoned by God, he cries out in prayer. And often God listens to this prayer. the prayer is meant to affect God and to change God's mind, change God's disposition. Often you'll see, oh, you've hidden your face from me. You're letting my enemies prosper. And the prayer is meant to affect God on a personal level and to right the wrongs. Sometimes within the Psalms, God is being described as almost shirking his duties. And prayer is the proper response to get God, because he does have some sort of obligation to rule the world in a righteous manner, to come down against the evil people of this world, the Hillary
I'll
Clintons
ask
and
you,
the Faucis.
I'll ask a quick question based on that. So if you see any given violation, um, I'm using like violation loosely, but like from what you're saying, like if you're saying God did a certain thing that you don't believe should have been done, how does that play into if he is ruling the universe in a way where he is upholding a standard of righteousness? Like, how could someone conclude that God is perfectly upholding a standard of righteousness if there were certain things done that you would say shouldn't have been done? Like, what kind
Yeah,
of
I
standard do you give?
yeah, I think that's part of the conclusion of Job, is that there is not a universally upheld standard of righteousness. And so calling God to action is the practical and proper response. I pray all the time that God bring his kingdom, you know.
So let's go to your conclusion of Job then. What would you say in like if put yourself in the position of Job? I know it's your favorite book. Um at the end, after God says everything he says to Job and Job withdraws his legal case, what would you say? And this is a subjective question, but I want to hear it. What would you say Job is thinking of God at that moment? At the very end of the book of Job, like what would his thoughts be?
He's feeling defeated. David Kleins has an essay on the conclusion of Job, and basically he's a Hebrew scholar, and so he does the biblical word commentary also, in which he translates the whole book and goes through all the different Hebrew verses and phrases. His conclusion is that Job understands that his legal case cannot proceed, because might makes right, and he has to just withdraw it, and he just has to accept reality as it is, and that he's not going to get the justice that he was seeking.
In that case, wouldn't there be a lot of wouldn't it be really difficult to have a relationship with God if you're viewing it like he's doing something that's incorrect? Like if you're saying that it was wrong for him to kill David's son, wouldn't you say that there are extreme and dangerous implications to having a relationship with God because now you're not believing that he may always do right in a situation, and there isn't that full trust and that full perfection of your like the belief in his perfect nature, I would say. Like isn't there kind of like an issue there?
Yeah, some atheists do argue like that, and so that's a subjective evaluation. I think that the Bible is true, and how the Bible describes God is accurate, and the character of God, as I see in the Bible, despite those few misgivings, God is good, God is just, God is righteous, God is someone whose character I like. He has shown to be reliable in the past, and so I put my trust in him. Our trust is not based in metaphysical inability to change or anything like that. That's not why you trust your wife or you trust your girlfriend or anything like that. You trust people based on their character, who they are, their personality, and how you relate to them, your relationship.
Because of the fact of how you believe about how God can change, wouldn't you say that there are certain ways in which God can change and they're not predictable by human beings, and that there would be nothing that you could do about it if God started doing more things that you may not agree with? And doesn't that like scare you? Isn't that like a scary thing?
Yes. Well, no, I'm not scared about anything like that. God's pretty reliable, but he does have a wide tool belt. And so in Walter Brueggemann's Theology of the Old Testament, he talks about God encounters the same situation multiple times, and he tries dealing with it in various ways to try to make it come about, try to make his results that he wants materialize. And it often doesn't happen. There's one verse that says, "I punished the children of Israel in vain." He punished them without purpose, because what he was trying to do was affect repentance. And the entire story of the Bible, Israel means struggles with God. It's about man
Hmm.
struggling with God. God's trying what he can do to reach us, to have a relationship with us. But the people, they just reject God. And he laments
Could
over this.
couldn't you see this the other way around though? Like if God has the ability to do something that objectively wouldn't be correct in a certain situation, wouldn't it be technically possible under that type of worldview for a person to be able to correct God, whether it be through prayer or a petition, and they could tell God, "Hey, you're not doing something correct," and God would have to change if he realizes that the person was more correct than him? Because I think that would have a very dangerous
Right.
implication.
That's yeah. The Talmudic texts describe that quite a few times, and so there's a book about that called "Pious Irreverence," in which people affect God on that level. So the biblical examples again are Abraham confronting God about the righteousness of collateral damage in Sodom and Gomorrah, and then God adopting stricter standards of righteousness. So I think we can affect God. I think that's a biblical concept the biblical authors believed in, and I don't see
Quickly,
this.
quickly, because there's just one more minute. Otherwise, I'd let you go
Yeah.
on. Yeah, I've
No,
tried to be
I
good
would
with
love
that.
to talk. You should come on my podcast. We could just talk.
Maybe I will. Okay, so with the last minute, so when I don't know what to say right now. When it comes to the specific type of example that I was trying to name earlier, like a person could in theory pray and they would say, "Hey, God, like I don't really think you're doing something right here." You would view that as God could technically have been doing something wrong, and then a person could correct him. Like that, is that what you believe was going on in Genesis 18? Like that God was like
I
literally
I
just
I
destroyed everything and Abraham changed his mind?
I think collateral damage is acceptable. I just think that Abraham wanted a lower standard or a higher standard and lower collateral damage, and God was willing to accept that. So I wouldn't say God's original intention, if he wanted to just level Sodom, good and wicked, I think that would have been morally fine and just. But
Okay, so
because he has this input with people, people are able to tell him their ideas, and he accepts this input from outside himself. We find divine counsel scenes within the Bible, which God says, "Hey, how should I do this?" And then people approach him and they offer different things. Even Job, that we're talking about, has this divine counsel scene where it's like the adversary shows up. It's like, "Hey, look at this guy. I bet he won't worship you." And God says, "Okay, we'll test this out and see if that's the case or not." People are offering things to God that he considers and then acts upon.
I
All
think it's
right.
time.
All right, guys. Good job. Appreciate the decorum and the respect you guys have for each other in that cross examination. So now, what we're going to do, we're going to transition to closing remarks, and then we have some Q&A. So, audience, make sure you get your questions in, so we can throw a good Q&A at these guys. All right. That's it. Chris, you're up first for your 5-minute closing. All right. I'll start your time. You begin to speak.
So let's think about what we've heard tonight. So tonight's not a debate about what I believe. It's not a debate about what Jonathan believes. We're here tonight to see what the biblical authors actually believed. Did any biblical author affirm God has innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions, past, present, and future? I think Jonathan seems to agree that he does have generated, discursive, and maybe not innate knowledge, right? Because if it's generative, it's coming from outside of God, that's not innate. So if is this view of classical omniscience, is this what the authors believed? Again, we talked about it earlier. There's just nothing in the Bible to suggest that the authors had this type of omniscience in mind. His best proof text was this Daniel passage, which describes some things that are going to happen in the future. That didn't speak at all to innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions. So it's interesting. Why isn't there biblical treatises on God being a simplex substance with no dependencies, with a strange type of ungenerated simple knowledge? It's all these proponents do is they grab a handful of texts, pieces of them, and piece these ideas together. A biblical treatise on these issues just doesn't exist. It exists in later Platonist texts. It exists in Augustine and Aquinas. You can read all about it. Augustine also said that the Bible was absurd until he read it in light of Platonism. What would make the Bible absurd in his mind? You heard me talk through the plot of the Bible tonight. Does that sound like Augustine's deity? No wonder he thought the Bible was absurd. This is a deity of no potentiality, a being of pure actuality. those words, they're strange concepts to you. I hope they are, because they're not in the Bible. They're not biblical categories. None of the biblical authors talked like this, thought like this, or even entertained these concepts in their theological worldview. This Platonism is what motivates a lot of normal classical theism, dedication to third century concepts, dedication to Platonistic value sets. It's not a dedication to the Bible. It's not about scholarship, understanding ancient authors and their audience. It's not about using reading comprehension to figure out possible and probable meanings of any single text. Look how texts were used. They're not used as evidence, but as talking points. Some verse exists with a short phrase that might mean something close to what someone believes. And if I talk long enough, maybe it means what I'm saying. This is proof texting. This is grandstanding. It's punditry. It's not academics. To classical theists, the goal is not to figure out what the best meaning of any particular text is, but to come up with ways to force that text into a particular metaphysics. Think about the fallacies we identified. Let's talk about the fallacy of composition, thinking if God knows one or several things about the future, then somehow God knows all things. Not only that, but jumping to the conclusion that God has innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions. Do you see that type of omniscience being described in Daniel? I don't see it. Remember, the opposite's not true. One example of God learning, thinking, responding, or changing is proof that God does not have innate, ungenerated, non-discursive, eternal, unfalsifiable knowledge of all propositions. Just like who showed their case tonight? Think about a special pleading. Yeah, so these texts apparently somehow mean what Jonathan thinks about God's omniscience, even though there's nothing in the immediate context to suggest it. The Bible writers write like open theists, right? Sure, the text looks like open theism, but secretly they have this other system in mind. I don't think we could take this seriously, these arguments. So, think about how these texts were dealt with. When I asked about certain phrases and prepositions in certain verses, were there immediate answers or were there hesitations? Like Augustine, is he ashamed of the text? I don't actually think so. I give Jonathan the benefit of the doubt. I like him and I think he's a good guy, but sadly, I find it too much in the Christian world that the world is wedded to this Platonistic metaphysics, and the Bible plays second fiddle. The Bible says something, they don't care, they don't like it, throw the Bible in the trash. The Bible only exists to confirm what they already believe. I tell these people, you don't have to like the Bible. You don't have to be a Christian. There's other options. Have you heard of Platonism? Go ahead and convert to Platonism. It sounds like it's your thing. It's just the Bible doesn't support what you're saying. Personally, I don't want to live like that. I don't want to sacrifice my intellectual integrity for societal praise, for interpersonal acceptance, for emotional security, even affirm some sort of metaphysical model that I think exists. It's not worth it to me. Intellectual integrity demands we accept the Bible. It says what it says. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Chris, for that closing statement. All right, Jonathan, you're up for your 5-minute closing, and I'll start your time when you begin to speak.
Cool. Well, I just want to say again, thank you so much for having me, and it's been a really great debate. Some of the main things I want to say to close this out are, first of all, I don't think it could really be levied against me, a claim like exactly what I'm saying about the way that God has this eternal perfect foreknowledge prior to the world being created is something that I'm trying to import onto the text. And at the same time, like, looking at an open theism perspective, we would see that the exact way that Chris Fisher is describing his belief of the type of knowledge that God has and doesn't have, we don't see sentences in the Bible that are exactly outlined in that exact way too. When we're looking at theology systematically and trying to come up with proper hermeneutics, how we're supposed to read the Bible, what the Bible is overall supporting, we are not going to see our exact wording always in that text, and that's just a reality that we have to accept. The main mechanism that I was looking at in the perspective of why these proof texts, which there are a lot of proof texts that fit into the category of God understanding a future free will decision and knowing it as a certainty and not in a way an open theist would read as just a possibility that could go either way. The reason why that does disprove any type of open theism, no matter how mild or extreme the view may be, depending on who you're speaking to, is because of the fact that if you are an open theist, you have to believe that there are these variables, there's this chance, there's this way that God can take a risk and not be correct about a certain situation, and there's a way that God could think one thing's going to happen and it really doesn't. Here's the problem. If God is not unilaterally bringing something about or learning by experience, there's no explanation for how a specific future free will decision can be known, especially one that's going to happen thousands of years later under the open theism framework. Therefore, the type of knowledge that I'm describing tonight, like a perfect foreknowledge of everything that's going to happen, is the only way that we can explain this type of knowledge that God has. And again, we're both like being respectful, letting the other person talk and cross-ex. So that full explanation didn't really get out during the first cross-examination, but that is what I was trying to outline and what I definitely did nail down in my first case, that because of the fact that God's not unilaterally bringing something about or not learning through experience, there's all this other information that God knows, and we're wondering how exactly this is the case, but it's because of his perfect knowledge. And the other thing that was highlighted is that there really is no narrative that we see in the Bible that like God cannot understand humanity, or there was some issue with like how God created them where he doesn't know a certain outcome. I believe that even just based on the fact, even outside of both of me and Chris Fisher's category, if God can understand a full range of outcomes, he would even be able in theory to perfectly learn everything that would happen before a situation occurs, which would debase 70% of all open theist proof texts where God is like wrong or taking a risk and failing and not understanding exactly what's going to happen. Therefore, the type of knowledge that I'm describing tonight is the only way to really outline how exactly God can know such specific things in the future. But lastly, I want to say that a lot of the implications that Chris Fisher was describing when I was cross-examining him, those are consistent open theism conclusions. When you get down to the way that the text goes, especially in Exodus 32, if someone believes that Moses was teaching God a piece of information, or in Genesis 18, where if you believe that God was going to, by that type of open theist interpretation, unilaterally wipe out a city, even if righteous people were in it, that calls into question how we're viewing God, how we view his nature, how we view his character. Do we believe that he never makes a mistake? Do we believe that he is perfect? Can we trust him unconditionally in any given situation? And I believe that when we come to the type of view that I'm describing tonight, that while God does have sovereignty, he also preserves mankind's free will. There's a trust there, and there is a true belief based on so many things in the Word of God, talking about God's promises, even going back to Abraham, talking about how the authors of the Bible describe God's faithfulness, which heavily goes toward my case, and I believe goes against Chris Fisher's case. We can see that these authors of the Bible truly do trust God. They truly believe he's perfect. And when they describe him, and when they describe the Trinity in the Bible, there is no talk of, well, there was this one time that God did something incorrect, or there may be another situation in which we can justly say that God wasn't right in this situation. But I believe that if you truly do accept an open theism type of position, I believe that you have to look at God that way. But the better way to look is the lens of how the authors really speak about God's character and really speak about his nature. And I, would disagree with Chris Fisher on the end of the book of Job. While I do agree that he withdrew his legal case, that much is true. I believe that Job understood, okay, there was a bigger reason for this. There's a reason why things have to happen. There's a reason why God tests. And it's because it's not to know things he doesn't know because he doesn't have a perfect past or present knowledge. It's because he's building our character. And that is the story of the Bible. God perfectly building our character to glorify himself.
All right. All right. Thank you guys. Fantastic job, guys. You guys did great. And the audience definitely agrees with me. So I win at the end. No, I'm joking. Nah, good job, guys. I appreciate you guys. So now we're going to jump into some Q&A. We do have a bunch of questions here. And we have one from everyone's favorite open theist, Will Duffy. Sorry, Chris. You're not the... You're not the favorite, Chris. No, I'm joking with you.
Hey, he's nicer than me.
Mr. Will Duffy. What's up, Will? Appreciate you. Big ups to Will, because I was looking for two open theists to participate in the 2-on-2 debate. And I messaged Will, and he couldn't do it. But he hooked me up with two other open theists to complete this debate. And that debate is going to happen in March. So nonetheless, thanks, Will. And thank you for the support. Appreciate you. For both, yes or no, did Moses believe God changes his mind? If yes, was Moses wrong? If no, then why did Moses ask God to change his mind? I guess, Jonathan, you want to go first?
Sure. So as I was saying in the cross-examination, I do believe that God changed his action. And when God is said to change his mind, I believe that's referring to events going from a mankind's perspective from one result to another. And I believe that really happened based on Moses' intercession. But when we dig down to the implications of why an open theist would believe that God changed his mind, the reasons would be limited. And I think it would have to be that God learned something from Moses that he was not putting into consideration before. And they would have to say it's because Moses taught God something that he changed his mind. And I'm like, I don't believe that's the reason. I believe that the act of Moses interceding and his heroism and standing up for the people is why God wanted to draw him to do that. And he wanted Moses to be a type of Christ in order to save his people and build him up as a leader. So really, I think either side, I won't speak for Chris, but I think either side would say, yes, like Moses did affect the future and change what God was going to do. But from my perspective, God already knew what that change was going to be.
So if you've noticed in the Bible, the people who interact with God, they don't have deterministic mindsets. They don't have the mindset of what God says goes, because God has this type of ungenerated knowledge of the eternal future or anything like that. They hear God say something and they're like, okay, I'm going to deal with that. I'm going to change that. Moses was no different. God said, hey, I'm angry. Get the heck away from me. And he stayed and he argued. And he believed that God listens to arguments. And so he goes down and lays a cascading series of arguments why God should not destroy the people. So it's very weird to me to hear this idea that he doesn't actually think that God considers outside input or has all this input and all of this is spurious or anything like that. It appears in the text, and it appears from all the latter text looking back on this, that every single person believed that Moses could change God's mind. Moses actually did change God's mind, and Moses changed God's mind for reasons that Moses proffered in that exchange. I think that's a pretty consistent biblical witness right there, from not just Exodus 32, but 3-4 different later texts looking back on it as well.
All right. And here is another question. Thank you for the super chat, PMA. Appreciate you. This is for Jonathan. If God engages in baby talk, as in to speak down to our level, how is it that Plato was able to conceive of God in the correct way according to classical theism? Was Israel dumber than we are now?
So in engaging the whole baby talk situation, I don't even think I use that phrase at all or ever have, as far as how I believe God is speaking to mankind. The way that I would describe it is when God is speaking to mankind, he's doing so with the knowledge in mind that mankind does not know the way that chains of events are going to affect the future, but God already knows it. So God is speaking in time to people based on what factors are in play and what the trajectory of events are going to be as far as outcomes based on human decisions. So I don't think that we have to resort to a perspective of, oh, God's like just speaking to a bunch of stupid people who don't know anything. I think he's just speaking to people based upon what the trajectory of events is going to be, where in reality, God knows the full chain, the full web of events of how things are going to unfold.
All right, Chris?
Yeah, it is interesting that people do have this weird assumption, like the biblical authors had this perspective in mind, but we don't see this perspective described anywhere in the text. They just secretly had it, and then they wrote like open theists. Oh, here's where it says God repented of what he said he's going to do. Here's where God learned. Here's where God had expectations that were thwarted. But they secretly have this different system in place. So that's why Calvin and Augustine before him have to invent this, and Philo of Alexandria, the Platonists, they invent this type of weird category just to broadly dismiss these types of texts. And it does seem like just a mechanism that they've invented for the sole purpose of not having to take this text on the face value.
All right. And here's a question for you, Chris, here. Thank you, Reverend, for the question. If it can be shown, God knows by seeing, if it can be shown once that he decrees something without foresight, shouldn't we ground all that God sees as having been blindly decreed?
I listed like 4 or 5 different ways that God knows things. God knows things because he brings them about. He knows because he sees. He knows because he tests. There's a bunch of different ways God knows because he predicts. We see in Psalms 139, God, you have searched me and known me. then he goes on to say, before a word is on my tongue, you know it altogether. This is linked to David's idea that God searched him to understand his character and how he's going to act. Maybe I have a daughter that I spend a lot of time with. I know she's going to ask me for ice cream. It's going to happen. At the end of Psalms 139, he asks God again to test him. He says, test me, God, and see if there's any wicked way in me. So it's not limited to seeing. And the knowledge that's being described is not Platonistic categories of knowledge. Again, I've stated that I know things in the future. I don't know these things in the future because I see them or anything like that. I know because my experience tells me they're going to happen. Tomorrow, I'm not going to go to work. I'm going to bring my daughter in to get her braces fixed. It's what's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. And we know I know it's going to happen because after it happens, I could post a little thing saying, hey, this happened. And it's not unfalsifiable knowledge. That was one of the categories we talked about with the type of knowledge that they claim. They claim this must happen 100%, but then it doesn't have to. In the Bible, we see time and time again that this knowledge is falsifiable knowledge. It doesn't have to materialize. So I think the basis of this question is assuming something I didn't claim, if that makes sense. Am I misreading that, Jonathan?
No, I actually was going to say when I was reading that and listening to your answer, just me personally, I don't see how it really links into the debate. So I was just going to say I don't even have anything to say about it. I'm not saying it's like a bad question. I'm just saying I didn't really feel like we talked about that.
All right.
Yeah, God decrees things all the time. Yeah.
All right. And here's another question for you, Jonathan. You said Genesis 6:6 means God was grieved that man became sinful. Does the text read God was sorry that man became sinful, or God was sorry that he had made man?
Well, I get that it says that he was sorry he made them. That means he had grief inside deeply that he did that. But I don't think we should read that like he made a mistake or made an error. Or if anyone were to ever say that that was like a wrong or sinful action, I don't think we should read it like that. And I'm not ashamed to say simply because of the implications. And I explained that earlier, and I think it's sound. I think that my explanation to that was a pretty sound one. When God, let's take it under an open theism perspective. If God is taking a risk and making mankind because he wants to have a true love-faith relationship with them, where is the error? Where is the sin in taking that risk if they end up betraying him? I don't see that as a problem with something God did at all, even under that perspective. When there comes with risk and free choice and what people will do, especially from a consistent open theism perspective where there isn't like this full knowledge or even a full intention of exactly how mankind is going to be created. That's my opinion of how a more consistent view would look. I just don't see why God would look at his action as wrong in that sense, or like that God did something wrong. I think mankind should be blamed for their own actions if they do something wrong, and God giving someone an opportunity to do something right and then messing it up is not on him.
Yeah, God says it, and then the narrator says it. And so a question would be, what would the text have to say for you to believe that the text is actually saying God regretted his own actions? Is there a combination of words that would convince you the text is actually saying that?
Are you asking me?
Well, I guess you don't have to answer, but yeah. So I do think God's blaming himself. Like, let's say you have a kid and it turns out to be like a Jeffrey Dahmer type. You might say, "I'm sorry, I had this kid. This was a mistake," and it's not necessarily directly my fault, but I could blame myself for my process in the outcome. And so it's not like a complete blame situation. Like Terence Fretheim, I went to a lecture of his. There was an open theist trying to explain away all evil that could be attributed to God. And they use a hermeneutic in which all God's actions must be based on love, and he can't do any coercive acts or anything like that. So he can't be blamed for evil. And Terence Fretheim said, well, within the Bible, God does take responsibility for some of the evil that happens on earth. It's just what the text says.
All right. And here is a question for you, Chris. What does it mean for God's declaring the end from the beginning in Isaiah 46:10? How does God declare the future he does not know?
Yeah, so the text, I have a debate on Isaiah. Isaiah 40 through 48, Deutero Isaiah. And in it, you see contextually that the beginning is the beginning of God's act. And so the whole thing is a trial of God. God put himself on trial. Israel's judging. And he says, I tell you things before they happen so that when they happen, you know I'm the one who did it and not the false God. So let me read you just one verse from that same chapter. I'll pull that up. He says, do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? He's not declaring into like this empty void of nothingness, like, oh, he's declaring to people for practical reasons. Again, the Bible doesn't talk about metaphysics. The Bible talks about practicality. People are getting this information to use. And within the text of Isaiah, he declares new things never before revealed to them, demonstrating how he declares, to whom he declares, in what capacity he declares, and what the purpose of this declaration is. It's so that people can have practical knowledge of God's power acts and God's fulfillments. It's not a timeless declaration into the void in the context.
All right, Jonathan?
In regard to many scriptures like this, including this one, like declaring the end from the beginning, I do think that scriptures like that are good evidence for a position like what I have, because in open theism, God would have to change what he's doing based upon what human beings will do. And I think I don't know if Chris Fisher would do this, but I think a lot of open theists would say that God would be bound by foreknowledge if in certain situations he was making a final decision prior to human beings being able to make other choices that could change that decision. Therefore, when we're looking at God making a final declaration, like when he says that like he's not going to repent from taking away kingship from Saul. We see certain situations where I believe God is making a final choice and nothing can thwart that decision. And I wouldn't view that as God being bound by foreknowledge. I would view that as the aspect of God's sovereignty that I do think is biblically accurate. Therefore, linking this kind of text like God finally saying, hey, this is what's going to happen, I think that would be more favorable toward my position, because it's making an implication, in my opinion, that regardless of what people will do in this circumstance, my word's going to stand firm and they're not going to change my mind right here.
All right. And here's another question for both of you. It is prophesied that Christ would suffer and rise according to Scripture. Is it possible for the Son as a human with free will to have chosen to rebel against the Father and not go to the cross?
Do you want to go first or me? It's up to you.
Yeah. Jonathan, you want to do it first or Chris?
Oh, it's up to you.
I guess
you could have the second word. Well, yeah, it'll be more beneficial to you if I go first, and you can respond to what I'm saying. I don't know.
We could do that.
Oh no, it's up to you. Okay, I'll go first. We see within the Bible that the cross is not a fated event. Jesus is confronted in the garden, and he says, "Can I not call 12 legions of angels to save me right now?" But just so that Scripture is fulfilled, I'm not going to do that. So he believed that it was a possibility. He didn't think it was a fated event. And then we see later in the garden, he's praying to the Father, and he says, "Not my will, but yours be done." He says, "Let this cup pass from me." And so he doesn't actually want to do the crucifixion, and he understands that God responds to prayer, and he understands that God might listen to his prayer and change his plans. And so he prefaces it basically saying, don't prioritize my will over yours when you're making this decision. Instead, do what you need to do to make things happen. But if there is some sort of way other than that, can we do that instead? Because he didn't want to be crucified.
Jonathan?
In this sense, I personally believe that there was really never an actual chance that Jesus was going to go against what the Father wanted. I believe that in the hypostatic union, there's this situation where like there's this conflict, but I don't believe there's ever sin on Jesus's part of like making a determination, like I'm not going to do what the Father wants. I believe the whole time he was perfectly submitted to the Father's will, and that's why he says, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. But I believe that in that struggle of him like having flesh as well, like that was something he fought and it never overcame him and it never took him over. But there was definitely that conflict there. But I think that just because there was the conflict and just because he said, don't you think I could call down, I think it was like 12 legions of angels and they could rescue me, just because that may have been a technical possibility, I don't believe that it was something that from God looking at the earth, like he ever thought that that would be something that was going to happen. So I think there's a distinction between what could technically be possible and what was actually going to happen, if that makes sense.
All right. And here is a question for both of you again. How do you make sense of Isaiah 41:23? I need to make it a practice. Whenever I see these questions that have scripture in it, I should have that like ready and queued.
All right. So this is the ESV, Isaiah 41:23. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Do good or do harm, that we may be dismayed and terrified. And so I think we're going to have the same opinion on this. But go ahead.
I guess I'll go first to be fair. I guess I know going second's technically like better. With this, I would say it does fit into the category that we were speaking about earlier. Like God can do things where they cannot be thwarted at all, and that's his advantage over the false gods. One of the many, but it's the one that's being spoken about here. So I don't really think this fits into either category, like in a specific way. I just believe it is making a specific power claim about God, that he is infinitely more powerful than any false god. But I do think that someone could read this and say, there are ways that God can do something and they can't be thwarted. And I could see how that could go against an open theist position, but I'd say it just speaks of God's omnipotence, which I think a lot of people would agree with the general definition of omnipotence. And I definitely do agree with omnipotence.
Yeah, so let me read quickly the verse right before that, preceding that, to give it a little context. Let them, the false gods, bring them, let them tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, that we might consider them, that we may know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. And so what this trial is, God is on trial, Israel's judging. He says, I'm the true God, these are false gods. You know that's true because they only take credit for things that happen after the fact. They say, oh, my God did that over there. It's like, what's your evidence? And God's evidence is that I told you before, I said you're going to go into exile, Israel. I said you're going to be taken by the Syrians, the Babylonians, and then it happens. And because I told you before it happened, that means I did it. Because you don't just get to take credit after the fact like what was happening with these pagan gods. And so this is part of God's power and him demonstrating to them his power and his value.
All right, all right. And here's a question from Mr. Warren McGrew, Mr. Ida Killer. What's up, Warren? Hope things are well with you. All right, a couple of questions for you, Jonathan. Does God know Jesus is now resurrected in heaven, interceding for us? How is this not a change in knowledge?
Chris, maybe you could explain this. I don't fully understand how what he's saying would contradict the position that I have. Do you know like what he's going for here?
So is there a change in God's knowledge about current states? So does God now know Jesus is now resurrected? So was there a time where God didn't know Jesus was resurrected because it didn't happen yet? And then the resurrection happens, and then his knowledge set changes, and he knows, yeah, now Jesus is resurrected. So you have some sort of variables or propositions, tenses, phrases within God's knowledge set changing.
Oh, I believe it's perfectly okay for us to say, yeah, the Bible concludes that there is and are statements of present knowledge, but I just don't believe that those would I don't believe that those would be in conflict with God understanding the beginning to the end, and not only power claims, but also in what his plans are, because of the fact that even though there are free will beings, because of the fact that I believe God does fully understand the range of what people will do and what they'll do in any situation. I do believe he still perfectly knows the range of outcomes, as well as when things presently happen, when they're put in the Bible, like he knows this. I still believe that he knows that. So I don't think there's ever a conflict with like that he wouldn't know something that's currently happening.
Yeah, so I think Jonathan's an open theist still, despite his claims. I've heard a lot of statements about God learning and making decisions and making decisions based on human actions. And so Augustine had this idea that God could not talk in time. So when he says, "This is my beloved son," you read Confessions chapter 11, he said, this is not actually God talking, because talking involves sequence. Sequence involves dependency, involves change. It violates some fundamental principles of Calvinist and Augustinian metaphysics, in which God is a pure simplicity. God can't have these dependencies that being in time creates. And so if God has a changing knowledge set based on tensed propositions, then that's open theism.
All right. And here is a question here for both of you. Did I send it? I think I messed up on that one. Oops. Let me see if I can find it real quick, because I had it queued and I don't want to miss it. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Oh,
you gotta fill that dead space. You gotta fill the air. It's silence.
Yeah, that sucks, man. I'll try to find it, but I'll post this question instead to sort of fill it in. Question for you, Mr. Jonathan. In theism, God created the world, then left us to our own devices. Why is open theism not semi-deism?
Well, I think that under open theism, there would still be, if I'm understanding this question correctly, there is still like this certain aspects of a concrete plan that God would have that he wants from creation. And I believe that even under, like, and in my perspective, there's that, and God understanding the way that his plans plus the free will decisions of mankind, it's going to result in an ultimate that may not have been the original if there wasn't free will, but it's still going to result in God's glorification. Yet, even though I find my view more favorable there as far as God's glorification, I really wouldn't put open theism there, because I believe God does have concrete plans and makes a lot of power claims of what he is going to accomplish. So I think that would probably be a separate category, but that's just my opinion. I'm not like the president of anti-open theism.
Yeah, it's interesting in Judges, read through Judges, and there's seemingly random events that seem to be God's actions based on prior events. Maybe someone gets a curse put on them, and that curse fulfills. God has a duty to fulfill. That's actually pretty interesting in the Bible, that God has a duty to fulfill curses, or there's some sort of mechanism by which curses are effective. And so God has to stop Balaam from cursing Israel, things like that. But in Judges, my point being, there's a very intricate details of modern life, not modern life, ancient life, and modern life, that God is involved with in ways that we don't see, that we don't understand, that we might not be aware of, but there's always those workings behind the scenes. And so you might find semi-deism in open theism, or you might be using it as a slur or poisoning the well for just any open theist. That's fine. My biggest question is, what does the Bible teach? I don't know.
All right. And we have two more questions, then we'll shut this thing down. This is actually coming from an atheist here, Travis. Chris, is open theism a slippery slope to atheism? Why not simply conclude this book is written by men that lied, similar to other religions you know are false?
Well, those are two separate things. What the text says is a different question than is the text true. And it's actually funny. In one of my debates, one of the more toxic debates, it was like on a Discord chat, and an atheist popped in. He said, "What are you debating about?" Or he said, "Well, what the Bible says." He's like, "Well, the Bible's not true." It's like, that's not what we're debating about. It's like, what does the Bible say? And the whole question was about Isaiah 40 through 48. And he's like, this Chris guy is actually making a lot of sense. This Calvinist guy is just like off his rocker about what's happening in this text. And so I do appreciate atheists who use canonical criticism. People like Christine Hayes, she's not a Christian. People who use canonical criticism to judge and evaluate the text on its own merits. And rational people can come to different conclusions about what the data means. I don't fault atheists. I think the Bible's true. I think there's some pretty good evidence for biblical claims. We're getting carbon dating from dinosaur bones. We're getting sites like Sodom and Gomorrah turning up. We got plenty of good evidence that the Bible is fairly reliable in what it's describing. And so results may vary, but I think that evidence supports that the Bible is factual.
All right. And here is our final question of the evening. Both, doesn't this mean open theism? Revelations 22:19, and if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life. What do you say, Jonathan?
Do you want to go first or me?
Sure. I guess Marlon has chosen me by fate.
Oh.
So in this situation, I do believe in cause and effect. Technically, even in my view of perseverance, I do believe that God is helping people and making people persevere. I won't even say helping. I'll say he is making people persevere by keeping them away from things that would make them fall away. It's more of a situation like they do have to endure, but God gives them the power and strength to. Therefore, when we're going to this question, I do believe that this is a reality, but I believe that certain things that would technically make people fall away, God gives them the strength and puts the circumstances in a place where he doesn't let them go through more than they can go through, and he makes them persevere through those means. So I don't really also on the second point see why this would be a specific open theism phrase. Like I definitely believe in my position there's a legitimate cause and effect. I just believe that there's no factor at play where God is wondering how it will play out. I believe that he knows the way that everything will play out. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, so this verse is interesting because there are textual variants. I think the critical text says God will take away his part out of the tree of life, and it's the majority or Byzantine text that says the book of life. But we see in Revelation throughout that the book is a fluid book, which names are added as people come into the fold and they are removed due to certain conditions. Your name could get blotted out of the book of life. And you see books like that operate pretty similarly throughout the Bible. In Malachi 3, at the end of it, there's a brand new book written, and that book is written to add names to it of current righteous people to assure them they're not going to be accidentally punished when God brings justice and righteousness onto earth. And so these books seem to be fluid and dynamic. And so a lot of times people will use the book of life in Revelation. They'll apply certain dependent clauses and have them modify the wrong words. But this book of life is dynamic. It's not a static list of names, and we do see those additions.
All right, guys. Good stuff. Well done. Now you guys can take a deep breath because it's over. It was great, guys. It was a pleasure having you guys on for this debate, and I think that the audience definitely got a lot out of it. I always tell people that come on, whether they walk away with their minds changed or not, the one thing they should walk away with is having a better understanding of their opponent's position. And I encourage both of you to do the same, right? It's a difficult thing to prepare for debates because you're trying to prepare for every single response that your opponent could possibly come with. And obviously you're going to forget things. And I guarantee when you guys are done, when you guys cut off YouTube and lay in your bed tonight, you're going to be like, man, I should have said that. Dang, you know, always.
It's already happened.
It's already happening. Good stuff, guys. I appreciate you both. You guys have any closing words before I shut this thing down?
No, I thank you for having me. And Jonathan Singleton, I got nothing against you. I like you as a human being, and I hope you're my friend.
I want to say thank you to both of you guys. You both given me a very fun and just like legitimately joyful opportunity. And I'm very, very thankful to both of you guys. And I'd definitely be down to talk to both of you guys in the future and discuss whatever. So thank you to both of you guys. Awesome.
All right. So I'll be, I always tell guys also to keep the notification bells on with my messages in particular because I might slide it to y'all DMs. So, just keep the notification bell on. So thank you guys once again, man. I'm going to let you guys go. Enjoy the rest of your evenings. All right.
Thank you.
All right. All right, guys, another great debate in the books and another enjoyable one. This was a great debate, and I really appreciate these guys taking time out of their schedules to come on, man. And like I said, this is a topic that's always hot and heavy because there's a lot of emotion here, because obviously you're discussing the God of the Bible, and some positions feel that you're saying God doesn't have a certain aspect. He's not all knowing. He doesn't have exhaustive knowledge and things like that. And then the other one is saying, if it's more the philosophical realm, well, if God has all this knowledge, then you could possibly implement sin on God and say that He is the author of evil. So there is this big balloon, if I could say, that causes tension. And sometimes if you get the wrong two individuals together, that balloon can burst. It could be a very chaotic debate, especially considering this topic. So I appreciate these guys for coming on and being able to keep themselves under control and together throughout this whole debate, man. And audience, I appreciate you guys. You guys are always great. You guys always show up. I really do appreciate everyone out there, and mods, a special appreciation for you guys out there who are trying to keep the live chat in order. Got much love for you guys, and I appreciate every last one of you for stepping in and doing that moderation, because I do appreciate it. I have a comment here. It says, Marlon, appreciate you, bro. Keep up the Calvinist biblical cause. Hey, the cause is for Christ, right? The cause is for Christ. Calvinism is nothing more than a theological position within the Christian landscape. That's all Calvinism is. And I just so happen to be a Calvinist. If anyone out there didn't know, I am a 5-point ironclad rigid Calvinist. So hey, it is what it is. But nonetheless, my cause is for Christ. It definitely is for Christ. And that's why I do the debates. That's why I do the interviews. So I do the little 3-minute clips on TikTok. That's why I do everything I do with this ministry, is because I want to glorify Christ. I want to glorify God and just lift up His holy name and pray that God uses these debates to bring people to Christ. That is the ultimate goal, right? To bring people to Christ. So I appreciate the love and telling me to push on, to keep going, but I do believe that this is for Christ and not necessarily for Calvinism. Once again, Calvinism is no more than the theological landscape that I'm viewing the scriptures from, right? Because I believe the scriptures teach Calvinist doctrine in many areas. So nonetheless, that is the whole point of what I'm doing. But I appreciate the love, though. You guys are always showing a bunch of love, man. I really do appreciate you guys. Super chats. I appreciate you guys who are just on here continuously. There are several people I always see jumping in live chat, no matter if the debate is with popular individuals or those who are less popular. You guys always show up, and I have a special appreciation, should I say, for you guys and everything. But nonetheless, make sure that you check out the other shows that are coming up here in the future on the Gospel Truth, because there's plenty shows, and I'm currently scheduling more shows and more interviews that are later in the year. I'm trying to get together a good philosophical debate with Dr. Tim Stratton and Dr. Alan Rhoda, and that one's actually going to be concerning open theism and Molinism. So if you've watched the other discussion that I had I wasn't in the discussion, but I brought Dr. Kirk McGregor and Dr. Guillaume Bion on. That happened, I think, in September or October, one of the months, September, October. It's going to be similar to that. That's my vision for the Tim Stratton and Dr. Alan Rhoda. That is obviously still at the infant stages of organizing. So we're still trying to get that together, but I think that's going to be a fun discussion, Molinism and open theism, because there are many areas that those two positions disagree on. So I'm looking forward to that discussion, and hopefully you are too. But certainly, as I always do, when it is absolutely concrete and solidified that's going to happen, you guys will be the first to know. All right. That's it. I'm getting out of here. And once again, I appreciate everyone out there for jumping on. And I pray that you can jump on again at the next show, all right? So make sure you stay lock and key what we have going on. And the only way you can do that is by subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss out on any shows. Make sure you hit that notification bell when you hit that subscribe so you get notified when I upload content and when I go live. You don't miss out on anything, all right? That's it. I'm going to get out of here, and I pray that you have a blessed evening. May God bless you, and may God keep you. Go.